The tamarind tree was already sweating its shade across the market when Sarian tightened the cloth around the basket of woven pouches and felt the rumble of the truck before she saw it. Heat rose off the dirt in blue waves. The air smelled of frying cassava and spilled coffee. Someone had left jasmine in a cracked jar by the bakery, and children ran with sticky sugar on their lips. Maurice's truck idled by the far row, its engine a low animal sound that set the hanging tins to trembling. He stepped down with the key heavy in his hand and moved through the stalls like a promise. She felt his shadow before his words, an elbow grazing her wrist as he reached past her to examine a scarf. It was a light touch, acclaiming more than curiosity. Her throat tightened. The burned blue scarf folded beside the scales felt suddenly loud, a memory pressed against skin. Maurice smiled and spoke of grand things. New wells, a contract for paving, a key to the town projects ledger, and the market listened. Some smiled back. Others diverted their eyes. Sam came with a stack of school papers and watched from the shade, small and steady. The mayor, Alonzo, was across the way, hands folded, a mouth practiced in evenness. The moment was brief but heavy. A neighbor pressed coins into the jar at Sarian's stall, and the world settled again, but the touch had left a bruise in the air. Whispers threaded the alleys by noon. By evening, the rumor was a map. Who stood where, who owed whom. The teacher Sam, who brought spare chalk to the children and mended books on breaks, crossed through the market with a deliberate gait and a face that did not do ease. The pastor, Miriam, passed with her hymnals, lips moving as if rehearsing consolation. The ledger keeper Ramon peered from his shaded window and let his pen rest long on a page. Etta the baker slid a tray of warm loaves to Sarian and said nothing at all. Her hands trembled with 1,000 small prayers. Sarian kept her voice in narrow channels those first days. She unhooked her burned blue scarf from the peg behind her stall each morning and smoothed the seam where the fabric had frayed, imagining the thread as an incision to be coaxed closed. People called her clever with thread and stubborn with price. She had learned, as a child, to read the knots of cloth the way others read faces, quick, sure, and without surprise. That skill had fed her for years, pouches, repairs, small embroidered orders for weddings and wakes, and had taught her to measure risk like hemline, not with hope, but with habit. Her backstory made its own slow drum. As a girl, she had watched her mother stitch till dawn, hands smelling of dye, humming into the quiet. They had mended more than clothes. They had held a house together with seams and small economies. A jar of coins under the floorboard, a list of names who would give a day's work to another in storm months. The blue scarf had come from a wedding table, cut from leftover fabric and singed by a near-accidental lantern in a kitchen long gone. The mark on the cloth was a private geography, scar that folded into memory, a token of a night when the house had been full of guests and a lamp had tipped. It was not tragic in tale, but it had taught Sarian to keep one hand on the hem of things and the other on the ledger of what could be replaced. Betrayals had come later in ways that mattered. A partner who promised more than he could hold. A customer who paid late and left with a smile. Those losses had taught her to name what was owed and to keep witnesses. When the men came with easy money, offers to buy her stall, to take care of licensing, she had answered with a price and a witness. Courage for her was a ledger open on the table, a line for every promise. That ledger had married her to a community of ordinary people who kept records like prayers. It had taught her to lean on the teacher who fixed torn maps, on the elder who remembered names, on the ledger keeper who stamped receipts for even the smallest sale. On the third morning after Maurice's touch, a thing happened that pulled the seams taut. He caught Sarian alone by the well as she filled a can for the stall. His breath was a warm wind. "You could have more than pouches, Sarian," he said, and when she did not answer, he slid a small envelope across the stone. It was a neat, folded thing that smelt faintly of cologne and the dust of offices. She looked at it and then at him. "I don't take gifts without record," she said. "You should know that." He smiled as if she had made a joke and reached once more for the scarf. This time she stepped back. The touch was heavier. The market bell did not ring. She left the envelope under the ledger keeper's ledge and did not open it. It was not a dramatic act, but it was a decision archived with witnesses. The baker, the children, Sam, who had been passing and watched her turn away. That night, Sam came by her house. The kitchen was low-ceilinged with a single fan that inhales dust and sighs. A small lamp burned beside a stack of unfinished pouches. They spoke at the table with the kettle hissing between them. "Sarian," Sam said, folding his hands around a cup, "you don't have to sit with this alone." "I have never sat alone when I could ask for witness," she answered, the thread of soft iron in her voice. "But I am not sure what a witness will do." "We teach children to speak if someone takes their pen," he said. "Adults have other tools, but the tools still work. Names matter." He pushed his chair back and leaned forward. "If you want, I can go with you to file. I can be a witness on the affidavit." She studied him. The light picked out a small scar by his ear where he'd once fallen off a bicycle. "You would?" she asked. "Yes," he said, "and I'll ask Miss Etta and Rahman. The children will sign their names if they saw it." "We will make the town account for the way it smells when someone uses power as a hand." Sarian's fingers found the edge of the burned scarf under the table. "It is not only power," she said. "People will be afraid." Her voice dropped. "They will be offered other ways to keep their mouths closed. Money will arrive in small, polite envelopes." Sam's face steeled. "Then we'll make receipts out of those envelopes," he said. "We will show them how records can be louder than promises. We will do it by the book. Affidavit, clerk, receipt. No theatrics, just the steps." "Will you," she paused, searching, "will you stand if the mayor calls it a tempest in a teacup?" "I will stand," Sam said, "if you ask me to." "Then stand," she told him, "but do not make me the cause of trouble for you." "You are not causing trouble," Sam said. "You are asking for order." They sat in the small lamplight, the fan worrying at the air. 8 exchanges had passed like stitches. She tasted the newness of courage in the copper of the kettle. The next morning she went to the municipal office. Procedural facts took shape like a clean stitch. An affidavit was written with witnesses' names. The county clerk recorded the filing and handed a receipt with a neat stamp. A case number was assigned. The intake window, 14 days for initial review, was posted on the notice board. A 10-day preliminary interview was scheduled on the clerk's calendar should they need statements. And the municipal officer told her the initial administrative response usually came within 30 days. The paper smelled of bureaucracy and ink, and Sarian folded it into the pocket of her dress as if it were a small armor. Days later, a small storm metastasized into a campaign. Someone passed notes along the bread line suggesting Sarian accept a modest payment. Another evening, her stall was found with a heap of pouches spilled and a jar of coins upturned as if by clumsy hands. A single scratch appeared along the peg where the blue scarf was hung, light as if to warn. The whispers grew teeth. Maurice's offers mutated into invitations with promises of employment for those who were reasonable. The mayor sounded cautious in public, and the pastor called for calm in the pulpit without naming names. One private confrontation came like a thunderbolt. Maurice tracked her after dusk, when the market lamp smelled of oil and the fan down the lane turned slow. He leaned against the tamarind trunk, the bark rough under his palm. "You could be part of something bigger," he said. The words were the same as before, but now the air tightened. Sarian set the ledger on the nearest crate and met him eye to eye. "Your bigger has a price," she answered. He laughed softly, a sound that did not reach his eyes. "We could build a road," he said. "We could bring work. Think of the jars full of coins you'd have." She felt the old tug of need, a stall to be expanded, materials that would save a season. But she also felt the cobalt burn of memory, and the new ledger held like a hand. "I keep records," she said. "I would need receipts." He stepped closer. The space between them narrowed to the thickness of a palm. "And if I offer you silence, what will that buy you?" he asked. Her reply came like a stitch. "It will buy me nothing that I can count." He raised his hand, not to strike, but in a gesture that claimed power, and then lowered it. The market was a quiet mouth at that hour. He left with his truck light glowing. She remained under the tamarind, the bark like a witness on her back. The thunderbolt lasted a breath, and then released. When Sarian filed the formal complaint, the clerk's stamp read, "Case 2025-0417. The sheet bore a neat receipt number and a note. Intake decision within 14 days. Preliminary interviews possible within 10 days thereafter. Initial administrative response to be expected within 30 days. Hearing likely to be scheduled around 67 days from the filing for public adjudication." The number sat on the page like a calendar, timelines that turned gossip into a record. The whisper campaign shifted. A man left a small envelope at Ramon's door with a ledger entry half erased. Etta found a polite letter offering sponsorship of the choir if the town would soften its stance. The pastor preached about reconciliation and visited Maurice in private, his hands folded as if drawing threads together. Some neighbors counseled Sarian to accept a private settlement. "It saves everyone trouble," they said, while others brought their own receipts and notes and offered to be witnesses. The town split in a way that was not loud but precise, choices made in small, ordinary acts. At roughly 1/3 of the way through this unwinding, there was a quiet pause in the market narrative that asked for attention beyond gossip. If you would like to respond, start your comment with "I come from" and a short sentence about your town or village. No details of personal harm, please. If this feels heavy, pause. Your safety matters. Share only what feels safe and constructive. They counted days now in the language of forms. 10 days became a small constellation. The clerk's stamp, the thin calendar pages, the envelopes arriving with requests for statements. When the intake decision came, an official line that promised inquiry, some felt relief. Others read the same lines as a promise of prolonged exposure. Sarian folded the notice once, twice, then tucked it next to the ledger where the ink had not yet fully settled. The ledger was living paper, carrying names and sums, and the small notations she had made in the margins. A date, a jar, the tremor in a voice. Each entry was a finger pointing. They met in Ramon's kitchen, because the market was now a place where glances could be minds. Ramon set a kettle on the low flame and pushed a plate of flatbread toward Etta. The three of them sat close, elbows almost touching, as if proximity could keep the rumor shards from slicing them. Etta held Sarian's hand as if to anchor her. Ramon kept one eye on the latch. "We'll make copies," Ramon said. His voice had the steady rasp of someone who had watched storms come and pass his whole life. "You should not carry the ledger every day." Sarian nodded. She had been keeping the original like an heirloom, too precious and too raw to trust to photocopies. But she knew the risk. That night she watched Ramon make careful duplicates by lamplight. He folded the sheets into envelopes and sealed them with a smear of wax borrowed from a candle. "We leave one here, one with Father Mateo, one with the woman at the lodge who mends sails," he said, naming small, trustworthy reaches of the town as if they were lighthouses. "If something happens to you, they will speak." Etta's lips tightened. "We need more than copies," she whispered. "We need witnesses who will say what they know in front of those who must listen." Witnesses were scarce when silence paid and fear bought bread. But fear is not unanimous. A seamstress from the Eastern Lane, who had taken measured grief from Maurice's charity for years, came forward and handed Sarian a scrap of cloth tied with blue thread, a marker the seamstress used to keep accounts. "He paid me late last harvest," she said, and the way she said it, simple, unadorned, had the force of a bell struck. Others came too, in private, offering small things, a ledger with a corner torn, a bundle of receipts folded so many times the paper had the softness of a coin. Most asked anonymity. Some could not speak their names aloud because employment or kin were on the line. Sarian accepted the offerings the way one accepts splinters, careful, wincing, determined to remove them cleanly. Meanwhile, Maurice's strategy refined itself into quieter tactics. The scratch along the peg had been stage 1. Stage 2 was a suggestion of charity thinly veiled as goodwill. A letter appeared in the pastor's hands, sponsorship of the choir, an offer dressed as largesse, an old play to bind public conscience with the warmth of music. The pastor's sermon softened in cadence, calls for reconciliation threaded through his sentences like fine gold. He visited Maurice at the house with a loaf under his arm, and their conversation, though private, left traces on the town like oil on water. People who heard the pastor speak of unity were not always the same people who saw the ledger's ink. Sarian learned of the pastor's visit one afternoon when the pastor himself found a reason to walk past her stall. He paused as if at a shrine. Up close, his face was not unkind. His palms were measured. "You're brave," he said, as if courage were a thing one could bestow. "But there is a place for mercy." "You believe mercy and secrecy are the same?" she asked. He did not answer directly. "I pray for wisdom," he said, and with the words he built a small wall between them, sympathy and distance layered together. Not all the town's quiet came from fear. A few sided with Sarian openly. The baker, who had once been helped by a ledger entry, stood with his arms folded in the market and declared that no coin was worth a life of shame. A schoolteacher, young, with ink still on her fingers, took names and taught the children a folded song about truth. Small acts grew like green shoots. They did not stop the whispering, but they slowed its spread. The municipal intake moved on its own measured track. A preliminary interview was scheduled. Letters were sent. An officer's name traveled from desk to desk like a baton. When Sarian received the summons, the paper felt both like a promise and a summons to a private tribunal. She held it under the tamarind, the bark rough under her palm, and thought of Maurice leaning there weeks ago. Thunder that had felt like a threat now sounded like something wider, the weight of consequence. On the morning of the interview, the market smelled of fried dough and wet stone. People clustered at a distance. Some looked through windows rather than face the verge of conflict. Sarian wore the blue scarf because it had become a marker not of defiance, but of history, her past and her claim stitched together. Ramon walked beside her, shoulders squared. Etta had a bundle of copies in her satchel, and she kept glancing at the town square as if expecting a storm. At the municipal office, the room was narrow and bureaucrats read from prepared lists. The officer who would lead the interviews, an impartial man with fingers inked from his own ledgers, sat behind a table. He looked at Sarian with a kindness that did not preclude the weight of his duties. "We will record everything," he said. "You will have an opportunity to present your documents and witnesses." Maurice's emissary arrived separately. He did not appear as a man of threats. He was a fruit merchant who had once sold Maurice crates in the market. His presence was a reminder that power often arrived in the town under the shape of ordinary men. He brought with him a man from Maurice's circle who offered conciliatory words, how the town should move past discord, how investments and jobs were at stake. The emissary's voice was smooth as a well-polished jar. Sarian heard a man's cough from the doorway and looked up. One witness, whose ledger entry had been the first to incline suspicion, sat in the dark like a refusal. He had been listed as anonymous in the earlier notes, a word that had insulated him until that morning. Now his hands trembled on the paper he carried, and his knuckles were white. Sarian remembered the first time he had sold her jars on credit. He had always been careful with numbers, with speech. She did not know whether he would speak now. The interviews began with formality: names, dates, signatures. The officer asked questions that were neat and non-threatening, designed to peel truth gently from fear. Sometimes the truth came in a thread. He asked for the ledger, one witness said, and sometimes it arrived as a tumble of details. A man who had carried coins at night to a certain house, a list of names left on a doorstep. The ledger's duplicates proved to be shield and blade. The copies confirmed the pattern, but also invited denials. Maurice's emissary countered with claims of misinterpretation. Accounts can be messy, he waved, as if disarray could be an argument. Perhaps ledgers were for later reconciliation. When the man who had first broken Sarian's trust rose, his voice was thin at the start and then gathered like an answering current. He told of late-night collections, of jars emptied for reasons not accounted for, of favors exchanged under the guise of community projects. His words were simple and therefore damning. Yeah, nay, amount, date. He had kept a note. He produced it like a handkerchief. The room listened. Some faces turned away. Others drew a breath that sounded like hope. Outside, Maurice watched from the shade of his truck, a silhouette carved against the road. He spoke into a small device. No one paid attention to its hum, and a few of his people circulated back through the town like gray rumors. They left little gifts: a crate of citrus at the baker's, a promise of a new well to the women in the lower quarter. They worked within the folds of the community, paying small debts that made some mouths soften. Not all went according to his plan. A young clerk, who had been clerk to Maurice once upon a time, and then had been shown a ledger page that named his cousin, surprised Sarian by stepping forward to correct a record. "I kept the books wrong then," he admitted. "I was told to mark certain jars miscellaneous when they were meant for another ledger. I thought it was small. I was wrong." The name of that ledger spread through the municipal hall like a new light. Maurice's emissary paled. His smile thinned into a shadow. Outside, a cart trundled past with a child's laughter that made the town's present feel less like a courtroom and more like a place with a future that could be bent either way. At the end of the day, the officer read his notes and said what officials say when the story is not yet complete. There would be a hearing, a time for public adjudication where statements could be cross-examined and where the town could listen in a formal setting. The hearing would be later, a date that sat on a calendar the way a storm might, inevitable, looming. Sarian walked back through the market toward the tamarind, the ledger now wrapped tightly in waxed cloth, her hands smelling faintly of lemon and ink. The tamarind's bark felt the same beneath her palm, rough and patient. People greeted her with nods that were smaller than greetings but larger than silence. Some came to her stall and left a folded coin. Others simply lingered, trading a look that said, without words, "We saw you there." The ledger was both an anchor and a beacon. It tethered her to a truth that others could no longer pretend not to see. That night, in the small room above the stall, Sarian lay awake thinking of numbers and faces and the weight of names. Memory was not only a cobalt burn, it was now a map. She thought of the man who had come to her under the tamarind, Maurice, and of the way his hand had lifted as if to own the air between them. She thought also of the seamstress and the clerk, and the young teacher who kept the children's songs. She thought of the pastor's loaf and the mayor's cautious speech. The town had become a loom, weaving threads of loyalty and fear and courage into a fabric that would either hold or tear. Before she slept, she wrote one last notation in the ledger, a small, plain line. Testimonies gathered, copies secured, interview held. It was not a flourish, it was a record. In the days that followed, the whisper campaign grew louder in cunning ways. A rumor that Sarian had been paid by outsiders to create trouble surfaced in the bakery, seeded by a man who always knew which side of a loaf to butter. Posters appeared in the square, handwritten placards that spoke of scandal where the handwriting was careful and the ink new. Maurice began to speak publicly of healing wounds and rebuilding bridges, and the crowd he gathered had faces both grateful and uncertain. Yet there were also those who placed small, carefully wrapped loaves at Sarian's stall in the early morning and left before she could thank them. When the date of the public hearing finally neared, the town wore the look of a place that had been waiting for rain. People washed doors and stacked chairs and argued quietly about where to sit and what to say. Sarian found herself taking the ledger from its hiding place and holding it like a small, ridiculous talisman. She did not believe talismans held power. She believed the ledger held truth. That difference kept her steady. On the morning of the hearing, the square filled with bodies pinned to both sides of the road. The municipal hall steps would not hold everyone. Some leaned against the tamarind, while others sat on crates and watched with eyes that were both accusatory and tired. Maurice arrived with a retinue of men whose jackets smelled faintly of new cloth. The pastor processed behind him like a benediction given under protest. Sarian walked slowly, Ramon at her left and Etta at her right, and the ledger's weight was an honest, simple thing in her satchel. When they reached the steps, the air felt like a held breath. The hearing would be public. The town would speak. The ledger would be set upon the table. Witnesses would stand. Secrets would be named and weighed. Sarian stood at the doorway and inhaled. The tamarind's leaves stirred above them, casting the square in shifting green light. Whatever happened in the hall would not unmake what had been done. The papers filed, the copies distributed, the names that had already spoken. But it could change who in the town was brave enough to speak next. She stepped into the hall. The doors closed behind her. The crowd's murmuring swelled like a slow tide. Inside, under the municipal lamp, Sarian set the ledger down where everyone could see its spine and the careful, slanted letters that filled its pages. Someone in the crowd called her name, soft, single, not a shout but a summons. Sarian looked up, and in a voice that was steadier than she felt, she began to speak. "My name is Sarian," she said, and the hall tightened around the words. "I keep the accounts of what is done by those who govern us and by those who claim to care for us. I am not a stranger to these streets. I am the one who has listened. I am the one who wrote." She set the ledger open. The pages caught the municipal lamp and looked like pale sails. Her thumb rested on a line. She let it be a place for the eye to rest before she read. She did not read every name, there were too many, but she read enough. A seamstress named Leora. Her voice found a steady rhythm. She was given a ribbon and a promise. She sewed, and then the ribbon was taken back. A clerk named Harel signed for coins that were never accounted to the treasury. A teacher named Mirel had her classroom closed after she refused to teach from a book written in the hand of a man who owns the press. There are receipts, there are dates, there are signatures. There are mornings when men came and left with sacks disguising smaller sacks. At each name, a rustle passed through the crowd. Some faces leaned in, others leaned back as if shielding themselves. Maurice's jaw tightened. He moved forward a step and then stopped. gloved fingers pressing into the seams of his new jacket. "You read their accusations like a list of grievances," he said, voice smooth as oiled wood. "But who asked you to be judge? Who gave you authority to name what is scandal and what is service? We have rebuilt roads, we have fed the poor. You would tear down what others have labored to build." "You speak of bread," Sarian answered, "and yet there are names here of those who starved while loaves were taken in secret. You speak of rebuilding, and yet you would rebuild on foundations of favors and fear." The pastor cleared his throat. He had been a benediction walking behind Maurice. Now his lips tightened at the edges. There was a new gravity in his posture. For a moment, Sarian thought he would rise to defend Maurice. Instead, his eyes slid toward the ledger and then to the faces in the hall. He clasped his hands and did not speak. From the back, a woman stood. Not Leora, the seamstress's place was a patch of shadow. But Harold the clerk pushed his way forward, cheeks pale, his forearms trembling. He gripped a folded copy of a page Sarian had sent out days before. "I signed," he said, "because I was told to, because my son's fever could not be left at home. I am ashamed. I will say what I did." Others moved. A man with ink on his fingers, the scribe from the registry, held up a scrap of paper with a seal that matched a note in the ledger. A teacher in a shawl, Morel, walked to the front and laid 2 song sheets on the table as if they were evidence and prayer together. "He closed my class because the children sang different words to the psalms," she said softly. "He called their voices suspicious." Maurice's retinue bristled. One of his men stood as if to seize Harel, but Ramon was already by the clerk's side, an arm anchored at Harel's shoulder. Etta's eyes were wet but hard. She had been the one to copy the ledger under a lamplight that smelled of oil and lemon. She met the man's gaze, and without speaking, pressed a sheet of paper into the hands of the woman next to her. That woman's mouth opened, and then she began to read aloud a passage from the ledger, testimony of a widow whose bread had been diverted. The hall began to tilt. What Maurice had built with speeches and small public works was not immune to names read aloud in a room full of witnesses. His rhetoric faltered into fragments. He called them lies. He called Sarian a disturber. He tried to claim charity as armor. But the ledger was not a speech. It was a chorus of small harm done again and again. And the chorus gathered volume because it had been heard in kitchens and behind closed doors long before the hall was filled. From the square a sound rose, the rustle of folded papers against the ribs of hands. People who had received copies now showed them to their neighbors. A baker whose loaves had once been the site of whispered repayments lifted his copy and said, "This is the same as my list." A mother from the Tamarind Alley, a woman whose child had been kept from school for a week, pointed and said, "Here, my name is here, and the date is last spring." The ledger, once a single spine on a table, multiplied into voices. Maurice tried to regain the stage. "You would make us small by naming what we do," he cried. "You would make activity suspect where we have only tried to provide." His words slid like lacquer over the room, but they could not hide the staining beneath. The mayor shifted in his chair. He had always been careful about where his hands rested. Now his fingers fumbled with the ribbons of his notes. In that hesitation, the balance in the hall changed in a way that could not be measured by any one person alone. People looked at him, then at each other, and then at Sarian. The ledger's spine cast a thin shadow across the table, a clear line down the center of the room. Sarian closed the book and pushed it slightly toward the mayor, as if offering the town a choice in a language that had no flourish. "This is not for me to wield," she said. "It is for the town to receive, to read, and to decide upon." "I did not write these accounts to wound. I wrote them so wounds might be tended." Outside, the tamarind ruffled its leaves, a green sound like a question. In the hall, a murmur began that had the cadence of a tide. It was not a shout. It was a naming of self and neighbor and courage. Some who had come to hear Maurice speak now turned their palms up and showed the ink on their own papers. A few kept silent, fists closed for reasons both fear and bargaining had taught them. Maurice's mouth worked. He looked out over the sea of small revelations, and for the first time in months, his certainty cracked. He stepped back and, without violence, without spectacle, did what men do when scaffolds of influence loosen. He gathered his retinue and left, his jacket catching the light in one final, too bright sheen. The hall did not erupt. It exhaled. People stayed where they were, as if afraid to see whether the exhale would reform into wind or whisper. The mayor opened his lips, and what he said was a promise of investigation and impartiality, the kind of words that must now be measured by acts. He called for a committee of citizens, not appointed by him, but chosen by the square. Hands rose awkwardly. Names were said aloud. The ledger was to be copied and lodged in the registry with witnesses present. Harrell volunteered to help the mayor reconcile the records he had once signed. Morel offered to teach again if she was allowed the book she chose for her class. When the hearing dispersed, it was not with triumph or with defeat, but with the slow, complicated relief that follows an unbandaged wound given air. People spoke in low pockets and walked back through the square like pilgrims from a long vigil. Some touched Sarian's hand and left a coin. Others only met her eyes and nodded, a small litany of acknowledgement. Ramon stayed for a while, watching the tamarind through the open doorway, and then he helped Sarian fold the ledger and wrap it back in waxed cloth. He did not ask whether she had hoped to change everything that day. He only handed her the satchel and said, "You did this." His voice was simple, meaning everything. Outside, the market seemed to breathe differently. Crates were not yet stacked neatly. The baker's morning loaves were still warm enough to steam. Someone had left a small bundle of bread by the tamarind's roots, as if to leave an offering to what had been revealed beneath it. Sarian took the satchel, and with Etta and Ramon beside her, walked into the shifting green light of the leaves. She did not pretend the ledger had finished anything. It had only begun to make visible what had been known in pockets. But seeing is a particular kind of courage, and the town, slow and tangled and human, now had the map by which to walk. They moved through the crowd as the sun leaned thinly across roofs. The tamarind's shadow followed them like a witness. Sarian did not look back until they reached her stall. Then she paused. The town had spoken, but speech would take time to become action. In her satchel, the ledger felt small and true. She put her hand once more to the tamarind's bark before she climbed the narrow stairs to the room above, and the roughness under her palm was patient as ever. Above, in the lamplight, she unwrapped the ledger as if to check that the record had been kept whole. The pages sat beneath her fingers like a country still being learned. She had given voice to names. Now she would wait and watch how the town answered them. Outside, the square emptied into the soft late light. Voices thinned into conversations that would continue into evening and into the market the next morning. The tamarind's leaves settled. Somewhere a child laughed, small, resilient, and the sound braided with the distant clink of plates being readied for supper. The ledger lay open on the bed, a map that would not be forgotten. Dawn came the day the committee met, like a slow tide, not sudden, but unignorable. The square filled again, fewer than before, some curious, some resolved, some still shut by fear. The mayor stood at the foot of the tamarind, as if the tree might lend him steadiness. He had brought the registry clerk, 2 elders from the market, and a woman who kept the town ledgers for the granary. Harrell arrived with a satchel of his own papers. Morel came with her satchel and a bundle of exercises for children. Ramon and Etta stood near Sarian as if to form not a procession but a guard. They carried the ledger up to the registry in pairs. The building smelled of oil and dust and a kind of polite order. Inside, the mayor's promise became labor. Hands copied, witnesses signed, names were read aloud and recorded with extra care. The mayor did not try to speak his way into heroism. He listened as people offered corrections, as a woman named Tessa recited the facts of her father's owed wages, as a boy who had watched the market scales told where he had seen crates shifted at night. Where the ledger had named wrong, people corrected the ledger aloud. Where it named rightly, the town put its name to it with its voice. Harrell worked at the table for hours. He did not lean on the mayor's words or on public ritual. He moved through the pages with the look of someone attending to an old wound. At first, he merely compared entries and counted indentures. But as the morning passed, his jaw set in a way Sarian had not seen before. When their task narrowed to a cluster of papers with Maurice's unmistakable hand, Harrell paused and looked toward the window, as if the light outside might supply courage. He laid down his pen, placed both palms flat on the table, and then, quietly, he began to speak. "I signed what I was told to sign," he said, not to excuse, but to answer. "I believed I was preserving order. I see now that order and injustice can wear the same face." It was not a confession meant for absolution. It was a statement of fact. He offered to help reconcile every ledger that bore his mark, to locate missing receipts, to visit those whose names had been altered or concealed. Where people feared retribution, he promised presence instead. Nobody demanded theatrical repentance. What the day needed was the slow work of repair. Mireille sat in the doorway while they worked. When the mayor hesitated at a line about a child barred from the school on account of her father's debt, she stood and named the child by the book she wished to teach from. The mayor, with the ledger laid before him like a map he had not wanted to read, did not refuse. He said the word aloud as if it could be enforced more gently than any decree. That afternoon, Mireille returned to the classroom and set the book on the low table. Children pushed their chairs closer as if in response to a music cue, and she began to read. The sound of her voice made the windows look less severe. Not everyone came forward with gratitude or relief. A few of those named as beneficiaries of favors and leases pressed their lips thin and left without comment. One man who had once brokered the town's bribe contracts tried to insist that the ledger worried facts into a false tale. He was met by a woman whose hands bore the calluses of repeated work, and who produced a scrap of cloth with a ledger entry written in the same hand as Maurice's. The scrap bore the dates, and the men who had stood as witnesses the year before came forward to confirm. Confrontations were brief and felt less like verdicts than like the airing of a house that had been kept shut too long. Outside, the tamarind offered its private language of leaves. People came and went, carrying copies made dim by haste, but clear enough to point the town toward remedy. The ledger was not a talisman. Where restitution was possible, it was arranged. Wages redirected, a small parcel of land restored, a disputed stall promised to be reopened at the next market cycle. Where things could not be undone, old men who had died, debt spent into other hands, the town spoke of consolation and of practical aids to lessen the burden. There was no grand reversal, only a list of small writings and a resolve made public. Maurice, who had left the hall the week before with his retinue and his too-bright jacket, did not return to demand his authority. He sent a courier with a written protest that the ledger had been compiled from rumor and malice. The mayor read the letter aloud and then laid it on the table with the others. No one tore it up. People preferred to answer with facts rather than fury. The courier was seen later at the inn, his shoulders bowed, as if the work of carrying words had grown heavier than he'd been led to expect. Sarian spent that day partly in the registry and partly back at her stall, where she set loaves in order and let the ledger rest under her shawl, as if it were an animal that needed both shelter and exposure. She listened to conversations and tried not to treat every glance as accusation or praise. Children still circled her stall as if their feet wanted the tamarind shadow. Etta taught them, quietly, how to knot ribbons and how to fold paper birds that might carry apologies or small notes of thanks. That evening, a woman named Leora came to the stall and laid 2 coins on the counter. Where thanks might have been expected, she instead pressed her forehead to Sarian's hand and said simply, "It needed to be seen." She told Sarian that her brother had come home with his papers returned, that he was too shaken to speak of the relief, but that he had, for the first time in years, hummed while he mended nets. Leora's eyes were wet not from shame, but from surprise at the softness of being unburdened. Ramon, whose hands had once been awkward with the ledger's weight, found himself in small, steady work. He accompanied emissaries to visit those whose names were disputed. He translated what elders insisted upon into forms that younger men could accept. People called him when they needed a presence that did not belong to authority or to scandal. He offered himself as a witness and, when asked, as a friend. On a night when the moon threaded silver through the tamarind's leaves, he and Sarian sat on the narrow stair outside her room and spoke, not of great plans, but of chores and of whether the stall could stay open later 3 nights a week so the children could gather when adults were done with their work. There were gestures of economy and of kindness. The baker who had left a bundle by the tamarind in the first evening after the hearing found reasons to hand round loaves in the afternoons, charging little or none when he could. The granary woman suggested a small cooperative for storing seed so claimants might not be driven to desperate pledges. Morel started a nightly reading group for women who said they wanted to understand the ledger's entries and the town laws it reflected. Harel, who had sat with his conscience in public, opened his ledger and made lists that smelled of cedar and regret. He walked the market with a pen and attended the granary and made amends that required him to be present rather than performative. Not every wound closed. There were town families who had been broken by the ledger's revelations. Old alliances had been shattered and could not simply be resown. A few left in the weeks that followed, seeking fresh ground where their names carried less weather. Sarian did not imagine a town suddenly whole. What she felt instead was the honest, exhausting momentum of work. Weeks later, the ledger was lodged in the registry, wrapped in waxed cloth and bound with a simple ribbon. It had been copied 3 times, 2 for the registry and 1 for those neighbors who had asked to keep a copy in their own homes. The mayor had insisted that the ledger be accessible to any citizen at appointed hours. It was a small, deliberate transparency that mattered, because everyone could see there was nothing mystical about the ledger's authority. Only ink and testimony and the town's willingness to hold itself to account. On the day it was placed in the registry, Sarian took one last look at the tamarind before the sun's edge fell behind the roofs. She ran a finger along the ledger's binding as if to touch the town's memory itself. The leaves above her shuffled like a soft applause. A child kicked a stone and laughed. A woman sang as she carried water. The tamarind's trunk had a new nick where some years ago a rope had been tied, and Sarian traced it like a map notch. People did not come to the tamarind to celebrate victory. They came because the tree had become a marker in their daily geography, a place where speech could begin, where someone had once read aloud names and given others the courage to answer. The ledger, lodged now in a public chest, was no end, but a tool, to be read, corrected, and called upon whenever promises frayed. Its presence was a reminder that memory could be public, and that wrongs, once visible, could be tended to by ordinary hands. Sarian returned to her stall and set out a new row of loaves. She had no illusions about drama or easy redemption. The ledger had not performed miracles. It had given the town a map and asked them to walk by it. Each day would test the map in small ways. Who got the next stall, whether the mayor's committee would keep to its appointments, whether a nameless worker would be paid on time. But the town had made a decision: to watch, to act, to speak when silence would have been easier. That decision, Sarian thought as she wrapped bread and laughed with a child who wanted to know if the tamarin ever slept, might be the truest thing the ledger had set into motion. At dusk, she climbed the stairs and placed the ledger on the small shelf by her bed. She did not close it. She left it like an open letter the town might read in times of doubt. The tamarin shadow came through the window and lay across the page in a pattern of leaves. Sarian smoothed her hand over the paper, and then, because work still needed doing tomorrow, she doused the lamp and went downstairs. Outside, the square carried the ordinary noises of a town that had chosen to keep its limbs working. A cart, the call of a hawker, the low talk of neighbors comparing the day's mending. The ledger remained on the shelf like a map kept within easy reach. The town had the words now. Whether they would be lived was a matter of small choices and patient days. Sarian stepped out into the night and placed her palm once more on the tamarin's trunk. The bark was rough and honest under her fingers. It did not promise to make everything right. It seemed merely to gather and hold. A witness to speech. A witness to work. A witness to the slow human labor of being a place where names might be remembered and tended. In the morning, the market rose again, and people traded in bread and cloth and time. Their conversations threaded the square like the tamarin's branches. The ledger, now a public thing, watched over them not as judge but as an instrument of their own making. Sarian wrapped the loaves and lifted the satchel. She thought of Harold's steady pen, of Mirel's patient reading, of Ramon's quiet hands. She thought of the hours that would be needed to unpick wrongs and of the many small acts that, stretched day by day, made a town. She set off into the market with the tamarin shadow falling at her feet, and the ledger, open and waiting, remained a map they would consult as they went on learning how to live together.